Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unshaken, Staying Grounded in a Shifting World. I am your host, Ashley, and I am so excited and grateful to be back for another episode with y'all. I hope for those that celebrate, you have a happy Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving is in a couple days, and I cannot believe that we are at that point in the year already. So I hope for those that celebrate, you have a very happy Thanksgiving. And for those that don't, I hope you have the best Thursday of your lives. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the bigger topics, and that topic is polygamy. Yay! So this is one of the episodes where I did a little bit of research, and by research, I mean I pulled up 3 tabs from the Gospel Library, and I'm going to read them to you. So I did pray before this episode. I mean, I pray before every episode, but so hopefully the Spirit will say what needs to be said. And so let's just go ahead and start with the topics and questions section of plural marriage. And again, I apologize. There's a lot of overlap in the different sections, so if I say something more than once, I'm sorry. But let's just go ahead and jump into this. So this is in the topics and questions of the Gospel Library. So this is the overview chunk. The Bible and the Book of Mormon teach that monogamy is God's standard for marriage unless he declares otherwise. In limited specific cases, the Lord has commanded his followers to practice plural marriage. Some of these cases occurred in biblical times. From the early 1840s to about 1890, in response to revelation given to the prophet Joseph Smith, leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints taught the practice of plural marriage, also called polygamy. Over a period of about 50 years, 20 to 30% of Latter-day men, women, and children lived in families and practiced plural marriage. And actually, I did not realize until reading this that the percentage was that low. I thought it was everybody until I did the research for this. And so 20 to 30%, I mean, that's a small percentage of the church's population. And there was a little bit that I found doing this research. And actually, I'm going to link it in the description. Sorry, words are hard right now, apparently. So I found a video of 2 church historians talking about plural marriage. And essentially, one of them said that Joseph was very adamant about getting a personal witness on whether or not you and your spouse should participate. And I mean, that kind of goes along with everything in our church. We're always encouraged to get our own personal witness of things and not to take essentially anybody's word for it besides God's, more or less, God and the prophet, you know? So, but he was like kind of trying to keep it on the down low and just be like, you know, talk to God about it and get your own personal witness, essentially, and then move forward. And then I think it says a couple times in here that they also had to get like permission too. So it's not like people were just frivolously going off and marrying whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and having as many children at all times that they wanted. I was actually very grateful reading through this to see that there was order to it. And I mean, we know that God is a God of order, so it makes sense when you actually look into it. But you know, because it is a weird part of our church's history and people don't like us for it. And so it's, you know, it's good to look into from the correct sources. You know what I mean? Because you can find lots of not correct sources on it on the internet. And so that did give me a little bit of a sigh of relief of like, okay, it was very regulated and people weren't just going off and marrying each other all of the time as quickly as they wanted to. And, you know, there were some people that were okay with it, but a lot of people were not. And it was a really big act of faith for the early members of the church. I don't want to share my husband, you know, I don't have one right now, but like, I assume most people agree with that mindset of like, I don't want to share my husband. Like, I don't want to have 4 sister wives. Like, you know what I mean? And so it is a really big act of faith that these early saints stepped into. And that's why Joseph and I assume even Brigham were like, get a personal witness. This is between you and the Lord, and make sure this is something that he for sure wants for you and your spouse, and, the plan he has for your life. So, like I said, I will be linking that video of the two church historians in the description, and y'all can check it out if you would like. So there is a footnote number 2, I think. Yes. And it says, the prophets Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses are examples of people in the Bible who had multiple wives. And Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, is the revelation on this, on plural marriage. And so I'm not going to read that specifically to y'all, because I assume you have the general idea of what polygamy is, but it is section 132. And again, I'll be listing all this stuff in the description. But yeah, so 132, if you want to go read the actual, whatchamacallit, itself, the revelation. But I did want to read the footnote above it that said, that the prophets, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses are examples of people in the Bible who had multiple wives. So there's that little disclaimer, I suppose. Okay, so this practice required faith and sacrifice from both men and women. It was also a cause of significant opposition towards the church for many years, and yet the saints were committed to keeping God's commands and trusted that God would bless them for their obedience. Eventually, the Lord directed the saints to discontinue the practice. And so this topics and questions chunk is one of those where it has like 8 or 9 different links of like frequently asked questions, and you can just tap on it and it'll take you to the answers. So I went through and highlighted the stuff that I wanted to read to you guys in this chunk. And again, you can go and tap on the links if that's something you're interested in, and read the whole like chunk that it's got there for you. And there's also a chunk at the bottom that says learn more, and then it's got the gospel topics essay, plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, which I'm going to be reading to you guys today as well. And then there's gospel topic essays, plural marriage and families in early Utah, and then gospel topics essay, the manifesto, and the end of plural marriage. And so all of that stuff is linked for you guys if you really want to jump into the rabbit hole here. Okay, so the first chunk is, do members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practice plural marriage today? No, we do not practice plural marriage today. It was nullified, canceled. There was another revelation received essentially saying, okay, we don't need this practice anymore. And that was in 1890, and it was received by President Wilford Woodruff. Some church members did not accept the end of plural marriage, and several small groups split off from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, forming new churches with their own leadership. Their teachings and practices do not reflect those of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I thought that was important because I don't know if people are aware of that, that the offshoots, the splinter groups are not associated with us at this point, and they are not part of the actual church. The actual church's doctrine is no, we do not practice plural marriage currently. The revelation was received in 1890 to stop. So, the next chunk, will there be unwanted marriage arrangements in the next life? No. The purpose of Heavenly Father's plan is the eternal happiness of his children. God will not force anyone to enter or remain in a marriage relationship he or she does not want. The church teaches that these family arrangements will be worked out in the eternities according to the justice, mercy, and love of God and the agency of those involved. And this is actually really important, because this is something that God taught me recently, like outside of any kind of plural marriage research. I will always beat the agency drum, and agency is one of God's highest laws. I mean, look at the pre-existence. We had Satan and we had Jesus, right? Who did God go with? He went with Jesus because the right to choose is so important. And so it's how we grow, because we don't grow if we're constantly being forced to do what is quote unquote right. You know what I mean? And so anyways, agency, very important. So, it's really important to stress here that God will not force anyone to enter or remain in a marriage relationship he or she does not want. And that goes for monogamous relationships too. You know, we're taught that when we do proxy work for the dead, right, we do sealings for them. Because we don't know the dynamic of the relationship, right? We just find the people in our family line and we go and do their work. And so we don't know what it was like. We don't know if they want to be together or not. And so they are absolutely entitled to say no. And God is like, bet, okay, you won't be together in the eternities, because agency and safety are so important, right? And so if you don't want to be in the marriage, you don't have to be in the marriage. Essentially, honoring that agency is so important to God, whether it's a polygamous relationship or a monogamous relationship. Okay. There is a chunk that says, does the church teach that plural marriage is required for exaltation? And the answer is no. No scripture or revelation teaches that plural marriage is a requirement for exaltation, nor has this been an established doctrine of the church. In the 19th century, some church leaders taught this idea. Since that time, however, the consistent, unanimous teaching of church leaders is that only monogamous temple marriage is necessary for exaltation. They have also emphasized that such a marriage will eventually be available to all who worthily seek it. So there you go. Polygamy is not required for exaltation. Okay, so the next chunk is, why did the church teach and practice plural marriage in the 19th century? Okay, so both men and women testified of receiving powerful spiritual witnesses that it was God's will for them to participate in this practice. The Lord did not reveal his reasons for restoring plural marriage, which I think is really important to point out. However, the Book of Mormon, while prohibiting polygamy generally, explains that God sometimes commands it in order to raise up seed unto him. And then the footnote number 11 references Jacob 2:30, which says, "For if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people, otherwise they shall hearken unto these things." So essentially he's saying, for my purposes, sometimes it is required and necessary to essentially replenish the righteous population, right? And then once that has been established, then it's ended. Plural marriage among the early saints did result in the birth of many children into faithful Latter-day Saint families in a relatively short time. This helped to strengthen the early church, and many Latter-day Saints today can trace their roots to those families. And like I said, doing this research, I just got the overwhelming realization that, like, this was a really big act of faith and a really big, I would say, trial, honestly, for the early saints. Like, I've never honestly thought too much about polygamy. Personally, it has never really bothered me. It's not something that has been a testimony hindrance, I guess, or something that could potentially damage my testimony. And so thinking about it from the perspective of these early saints, like, it was a little overwhelming for me. I was like, this was something really hard that they chose to do out of faith because their Heavenly Father was asking them to do. So I was really impressed as I was reading. And yeah, as soon as enough seed has been raised up to the Lord, he ends it. He ends the revelation. So okay, next little chunk here. What is known about the beginning of plural marriage in the church? Some evidence suggests that the prophet Joseph Smith first received a revelation in the early 1830s regarding plural marriage. The revelation, written down in 1843, states that Joseph prayed to know why God justified some biblical figures in having many wives. The Lord responded that he had commanded them to do so. So essentially he was like, why did some of them have many wives? And God said, because I told them to. Sorry, y'all. I swear there's not an episode where my dog doesn't have to doesn't cause a distraction. So, jumping back into this. Okay, so this is still from the blurb of what is known about the beginning of plural marriage in the church, and then jumping down to the bottom half of it. Under Joseph Smith's direction, other Latter-day Saints also began practicing plural marriage during his lifetime. It was among the most challenging aspects of the Restoration for Joseph personally and for other church members. The saints were encouraged to seek a personal spiritual confirmation before participating. Because plural marriage was introduced quietly, participants largely kept it private. Therefore, the sources for understanding early plural marriage are limited, and some things about it may never be fully understood. Okay, jumping down, there's a chunk that says, what did Emma Smith know about Joseph's practice of plural marriage? And I think I'll read you the whole thing. Emma did not leave any contemporary record of her own thoughts, feelings, or experiences related to plural marriage. According to accounts of others, Emma opposed plural marriage except for a short period of time when she consented to at least 4 of her husband's plural sealings. Ultimately, she rejected the practice. Despite emotional turmoil in their marriage over the practice, Emma and Joseph remained deeply committed to one another. Emily Partridge, who was an early plural wife of the prophet Joseph Smith, reflected toward the end of her life on Emma's complicated feelings about plural marriage. I know it was hard for Emma and any woman to enter plural marriage in those days, and I do not know as anybody would have done any better than Emma did under the circumstances. And I thought that was such a sweet thing to say. I personally have always imagined Emma as very dignified and regal, and she was educated, right? Because she came from a wealthy family. Either way, I've always imagined her with educated vibes, just very well-to-do, I guess. And so I just imagine after reading this, her handling this with so much grace, at least maybe outwardly, because that's probably what she wanted to show the saints, but it was very hard for her, and I don't blame her at all. I mean, it's hard enough to be the wife of a prophet, I'm sure, but especially the prophet that's restoring the church that's constantly being persecuted, and then he tells you that the Lord has decided to reinstate polygamy. I don't know how Emma did it. She was a saint. And footnote 17 here is referencing or is linked to Emma Hale Smith. That was her maiden name. So you can click on that if you want to read more about Emma in the church history topics. All right. So down to how did women experience plural marriage in the 19th century? The experience of living in plural marriage was different for each woman involved. Some found happiness and fulfillment while others struggled. When considering marriage practices in the past, it is helpful to remember that expectations about marriage have changed considerably since the 19th century. This is true for both polygamy and monogamy. Participants in plural marriage understood it to be a religious practice, and they often entered it for spiritual and practical reasons. Women were free to choose whether to enter into a plural marriage. Church leaders, recognizing the challenges faced by women in plural marriages, expedited the granting of divorces to women whose marriages were unhappy. And I was really happy to learn this because like I said, I had never really looked into polygamy or plural marriage before, in the church's history. And so that made me very happy to know that. Again, agency, right? And so women also get to choose whether or not they're going to enter into it, right? And I loved how it said that granting divorce was expedited for women whose marriages were unhappy. And I think that is such a blessing and such a tender mercy. That really stood out to me and touched my little heart. I was really glad to learn that. Some women reported that plural marriage was lonely and difficult. At the same time, it allowed some to pursue education and find financial independence, often with assistance from other wives in their plural families. Ultimately, all who practiced plural marriage made sacrifices to live according to what they believed to be a commandment from God. Okay, and then the last little chunk here is, how did plural marriage end in the church? And the ending of plural marriage was a gradual process. In 1862, the United States government began enacting a series of increasingly harsh anti-polygamy laws. As a result of these legal actions, the church faced disincorporation by 1890 and was about to lose most of its properties, including its temples. And I didn't know that either. So that would have been sad if they lost the temples. In September 1890, after diligently seeking the Lord's will, President Wilford Woodruff received a revelation. Following the Lord's instructions, he issued a statement known as the Manifesto, which began the process of ending plural marriage in the church. And again, that is linked. I will try to remember to put the Manifesto in the description because I hadn't originally planned to do that, but I think I will, just reading through this. So yeah, it's the Official Declaration 1. Evidence suggests that only about 200 plural marriages were performed after the Manifesto. In 1904, President Joseph F. Smith issued a statement known as the Second Manifesto that affirmed the church's commitment to ending plural marriage. President Smith later authorized local church leaders to seek out and withdraw the membership of those who continued to enter into or perform plural marriages. So, to me, after having read this and looked into this for this episode, it reads as God needed faithful members born into the church, more or less, essentially. And then once that had reached the point that he deemed necessary, he stopped it. And so to me, it's pretty cut and dry. And I did appreciate how it said here that President Smith authorized local church leaders to seek out and withdraw the membership of those who continue to enter into or perform plural marriages. And so, like, it's serious that we follow polygamy only in times, or that, we participate in, I guess, polygamy only in times when the Lord dictates, and then as soon as he says that it can be done, we need to be done with it. And I don't know why, but that gives me a sigh of relief, almost like a weight off my chest a little bit of this was kind of supposed to be cut and dry, and there was a certain purpose for it, and it was executed in the way that the saints knew and understood how to do it. And then as soon as it was meant to be done, God told them, okay, this is meant to be done, because polygamy is not the overall arching plan, right, for eternity. It's monogamy. God is all about monogamy. So I don't know. My little chest was very happy to read that. That not only did they withdraw the membership, but they sought out those that were still practicing it after the manifesto was issued. Okay, so I thought I would read briefly from the church history topics about Fanny Alger. So she is believed to have been his first plural marriage. And this is kind of long, and so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I kind of just want to give a little overview here. And I think I'm going to start with footnote number 2 that says, Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger had no children. An anonymous individual claimed descent through a purported son of Fanny and Joseph named Orson, perhaps Orson, Smith Custer, but DNA testing ruled out Joseph Smith as this person's ancestor. No other documentation attests to the existence of an Orson Smith Custer in the United States during Fanny's lifetime. So they had no kids, essentially. Okay, so born in 1816 to Samuel and Clarissa Alger, Fanny Alger joined the church with her family in the early 1830s and worked in Joseph Smith's household in Kirtland, Ohio. Several Latter-day Saints who lived in Kirtland in the 1830s later reported that Fanny Alger married Joseph Smith, becoming his first plural wife. The marriage was evidently of short duration. Fanny left Ohio with her parents in 1836 for Missouri, apparently staying at a tavern owned by the family of Solomon Custer in Dublin, Indiana. Within a few months, Fanny married Solomon. She remained in Dublin after her parents continued to far west Missouri. Fanny's family followed the main body of the saints from Missouri to Illinois and ultimately to southern Utah. When Fanny's father, a patriarch, passed away in the 1870s, his obituary celebrated his family's faithfulness. So, and then it goes on to talk about how Fanny and Solomon had 9 children, and then just kind of a little bit of her background. And then there's the chunk about her relationship to Joseph Smith. Very little is known about the marriage between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger. The earliest sources emerged in the aftermath of the collapse of the Kirtland Safety Society in 1837. Angry investors in the society and local antagonists circulated many rumors attacking Joseph, including allegations that he committed adultery. Some of the rumors were said to originate with Oliver Cowdery, whose formerly close relationship with Joseph had become strained over a variety of matters. Some claimed, oh my gosh, guys, I'm really sorry. Some claimed Oliver heard Joseph confess to extramarital relations with Fanny Alger. Sorry. In fall 1837, Joseph Smith confronted Cowdery about the rumor in a meeting attended by at least 3 others. In that meeting, Cowdery refuted the rumor that Joseph had confessed to him. The following April, when Cowdery was tried in Missouri for his church membership over many charges, the High Council discussed the rumors Cowdery had circulated. Joseph gave an explanation of his relationship to Fanny that appears to have satisfied the High Council, and Cowdery was excommunicated during this meeting. So it was found that he did not have extramarital affairs, it would seem. Other than evidence of a visit in the early 1840s to her family, who belonged in the church branch in Lima, Illinois, Fanny's name remains absent from Latter-day Saint records for nearly 30 years. In the late 19th century, a handful of statements by Latter-day Saints and former church members indicated that Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger's relationship was an early plural marriage. Eliza R. Snow, one of Joseph Smith's plural wives, simply included Fanny in a list of his wives. Mosiah Hancock in 1896 and Benjamin F. Johnson in 1903 likewise described Fanny's relationship to Joseph as a plural marriage that was kept confidential. Hancock told of a private marriage sealing performed by Hancock's father in Kirtland. According to Johnson, Fanny was asked about her relationship to Joseph, but refused to elaborate on the matter. Though we know little about the introduction and early practice of plural marriage, Latter-day Saints honor the faith of early church members who sacrificed to obey this difficult commandment. So, again, I will link this if y'all want to look into it and look into the links and footnotes and stuff. I didn't know her name or anything. I just saw this linked when I was doing the research. I don't know if I really have anything to say or like any opinions or anything. Besides, it sounds like this was his first plural marriage, and I'm sure that things were still rocky and weird and awkward and confusing at that point when it was being first instated. And so, again, to me, it seems that she may have just not wanted to talk about it, because people are going to say what they're going to say. And I'm sure that it was very hard for her. And so I know personally that if people aren't going to receive something well that I've gone through, I'm not going to talk about it with them. And, especially something as touchy and big and easy to spread as the topic of polygamy, I wouldn't want to tell my story either, because it would just be, like tabloid fodder, essentially. Like that is just me personally and how I'm interpreting this. Please, if this is of concern to you, please look it up. I'm going to link it and please get your own conclusion. But that is kind of the vibe that I am getting from this. So anyways, Fanny Alger, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to jump over into the Gospel Topics essays, and this is titled Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. And I think I picked this one because this is kind of like talking about the introduction of it and how it started and everything. And this one is pretty long, and there's some overlap, So I'm going to try not to read the whole thing, but we'll just get started here and see where things go. Latter-day Saints believe that monogamy, the marriage of one man and one woman, is the Lord's standing law of marriage. In biblical times, the Lord commanded some of his people to practice plural marriage, the marriage of one man and more than one woman. Some early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints also received and obeyed this commandment given through God's prophets. After receiving a revelation commanding him to practice plural marriage, Joseph Smith married multiple wives and introduced the practice to close associates. This principle was among the most challenging aspects of the Restoration, for Joseph personally and for other church members. Plural marriage tested faith and provoked controversy and opposition. Few Latter-day Saints initially welcomed the restoration of a biblical practice entirely foreign to their sensibilities, but many later testified of powerful spiritual experiences that helped them overcome their hesitation and gave them courage to accept this practice. And I think that's really special and important to point out. I kind of said it earlier that they were encouraged to seek their own confirmation, and I think that that's a good thing to point out, just like in general, not even with polygamy, but anything that you find hard to accept with the gospel, to reach out to the Lord and to get confirmation from him. And I love that it said that it gave them courage to accept this practice. It would definitely take courage for me to have to do something like that. And so, that's what Jesus does. He gives us the courage to do the hard things. And if Jesus is going to be the one asking us to do something really hard, then I would absolutely argue that he would have to give us the courage to do it, almost. Don't quote me on that, but that's what it would seem, right? Maybe you'd get a double dose of courage if he's asking you to do something as hard as polygamy. So that's just my 2 cents. Although the Lord commanded the adoption and later the cessation of plural marriage in the latter days, he did not give exact instructions on how to obey the commandment. So that makes it even more fun. And I didn't know that either until I had started to do this research. He's like, do it, but I'm not going to give you explicit instructions. And so that adds another level of difficulty to it. And I do know that God gives us room to use our agency in a lot of things, right? And I guess it sounds like this was one of those things. He's like, I'm giving you this law, but figure out how to do it. Not in like a you're on your own kind of way, but to me, this is reading as, I know that this is going to be hard for you, so I'm going to give you some wiggle room to enact it in ways that work for you and make it easier. That's how I'm reading that. Okay, it goes on to say, significant social and cultural changes often include misunderstandings and difficulties. Church leaders and members experienced these challenges as they heeded the command to practice plural marriage, and again later as they worked to discontinue it after Church President Wilford Woodruff issued an inspired statement known as the Manifesto in 1890, which ended plural marriage. That we talked about. And it says, through it all, church leaders and members sought to follow God's will. Many details about the early practice of plural marriage are unknown. Plural marriage was introduced among the early saints incrementally, and participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. They did not discuss their experiences publicly or in writing until after the Latter-day Saints had moved to Utah and church leaders had publicly acknowledged the practice. The historical record of early plural marriage is therefore thin. Few records of the time provide details, and later reminiscences, you don't hear that word every day, are not always reliable. Some ambiguity will always accompany our knowledge about this issue. Like the participants, we see through a glass darkly and are asked to walk by faith. And the little footnote there, number 3, references 1 Corinthians 13:12. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. So I think this goes along with anything that the Lord asks us to do, right? There's always going to be an aspect of faith that needs to be had when the Lord commands us to do something. And some revelations and requirements are just going to be harder than others. But I would argue that those are the times when you would have a bigger opportunity to grow closer to God and to reach out to him and to talk to him about it. You know what I mean? And to me, this reads as, the early saints were under a lot of scrutiny constantly, just as it was in those days. The government in general, but individual state governments didn't like them. They were constantly being threatened and harassed and hurt and, things like that. And so I understand why they kept it on the down low, especially because it was not technically a legal practice, right? And so that has to make it even harder for them. And they're trying to do all that they can, right? To follow God, but to also try and follow earthly laws and, not be continuously harassed. And they're just trying to get to Utah so that they can worship the way that they want to. And God has only ever had imperfect people to work with, which has to be very frustrating for him. That's an Elder Holland quote from one of his talks. But it's true. And that reminder from Elder Holland has helped me a lot when I don't necessarily agree with... It's not that I usually struggle with doctrine itself. It's usually that I struggle with how... the member of the clergy, the brethren are delivering it. That's usually what I struggle with. And so I just remember, God has only ever had imperfect people to work with, first of all. And second of all, God knows us all perfectly and individually, and he knows us better than we even know ourselves. And so that's why, another reason why he calls who he does, right? To do certain things. That's why he calls the prophets that he does, because he knows them intimately and perfectly. And yes, they may have this one whatever, but they're human, right? We all have that one whatever. And so God knows who we are destined to become, and he knows what our skills and talents are. And so anyways, that was kind of a little bit of a tangent. But my point is these poor saints were doing their best, man, and they were just getting it on all sides, and they just wanted to be faithful members of the church, and they just wanted to do as the Lord asked them to do, and as Joseph asked them to do, and so I don't blame them for trying to keep it on the down low until they got to Utah, because their lives were constantly in danger. And so, yeah, let's not put more fuel on the fire to make people come and try and kill us some more, So that's how I am reading that. Essentially, again, please do your own research and talk to God about it to receive your own witness here. So again, this is really long and some overlap here. I might read this chunk right here. So this is the beginnings of plural marriage in the church. The revelation on plural marriage was not written down until 1843, but its early verses suggest that part of it emerged from Joseph Smith's study of the Old Testament in 1831. People who knew Joseph well later stated he received the revelation about that time. The revelation recorded in D&C 132 states that Joseph prayed to know why God justified Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, and Solomon in having many wives. The Lord responded that he had commanded them to enter into the practice. And this is kind of short. I might read footnote number 5 here. So footnote number 5 references D&C 132 verse 1 and then verses 34 through 38. Verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph, that inasmuch as you have inquired of my hand to know and understand wherein I, the Lord, justified my servants, and then all the prophets, my servants, as touching the principle and doctrine of their having many wives and concubines. God commanded Abraham, and Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. And why did she do it? Because this was the law. And from Hagar sprang many people. This therefore was fulfilling, among other things, the promises. Was Abraham therefore under condemnation? Verily I say unto you, nay, for I the Lord commanded it. Abraham was commanded to offer his son Isaac. Nevertheless it was written, thou shalt not kill. Abraham, however, did not refuse, and it was accounted unto him for his righteousness. Abraham received concubines, and they bore him children, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness, because they were given unto him, and he abode in my law. As Isaac also and Jacob did none other things than that which they were commanded, and because they did none other things than that which they were commanded, they have entered into their exaltation according to the promises, and sit upon thrones, and are not angels, but are gods. David also received many wives and concubines, and also Solomon and Moses, my servants, as also many others of my servants, from the beginning of creation until this time, and in nothing did they sin save in those things which they received not of me. So, there you go. I guess maybe careful what you wish for, careful what you ask the Lord about, because he was like, well, I just want to know, why they were allowed to have more than one wife. And God was like, because I commanded it. So surprise, also, you get the same commandment. Okay. Latter-day Saints understood that they were living in the latter days in what the Revelations called the dispensation of the fullness of times. Ancient prophets such as, ancient principles, such as prophets, priesthood, and temples would be restored to the earth. Plural marriage was one of those ancient principles. Polygamy had been permitted for millennia in many cultures and religions, but with few exceptions was rejected in Western cultures. In Joseph Smith's time, monogamy was the only legal form of marriage in the United States. Joseph knew the practice of plural marriage would stir up public ire. After receiving the commandment, he taught a few associates about it, but he did not spread this teaching widely in the 1830s. So that's kind of what I was saying, right? Is he's just trying to keep him and the saints alive and to not stir the pot. When God commands a difficult task, he sometimes sends additional messengers to encourage his people to obey. Consistent with this pattern, Joseph told associates that an angel appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842 and commanded him to proceed with plural marriage when he hesitated to move forward. During the 3rd and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandments fully. Sorry, I don't mean to laugh at that. It just caught me off guard. Oh my gosh. I literally had never heard that before. So that's crazy. So it said that this happened between 1834 and 1842, that this angel appeared to Joseph 3 times. So to me, this reads as Joseph was really struggling with this too. This is not something that he was super excited to just dive into with both feet and like, everybody, let's all just marry each other and all be married. Like, you know what I mean? He was definitely dragging his feet, not because he didn't want to obey the Lord, but because it was hard. And poor Joseph was just under so much pressure constantly and so much scrutiny and just trying to do the best that he could with what he had. And so, yeah, I would have been dragging my feet too to kind of try and enforce it. Not enforce it, but like really encourage the saints to look into this. That's crazy. With a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction. So that kind of gives, I'm going to butcher this. I'm so sorry. That moment with Moses, when he hadn't, circumcised his son or something like that. And so God got really mad and was like, I can't have you preaching to keep my covenants if you yourself are not keeping my covenants. It's essentially like that same moment, God was like, I can't have you encouraging the saints to engage in plural marriage if you are not also, keeping the covenant essentially and doing what I've asked you to do. So I butchered that. Sorry. Fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph Smith acted on the angel's first command by marrying a plural wife, Fanny Alger, in Kirtland, Ohio in the mid-1830s. So I read to you about her. Several Latter-day Saints who had lived in Kirtland reported decades later that Joseph Smith had married Alger, who lived and worked in the Smith household after he had obtained her consent and that of her parents. And that is footnote number 10, or there is a footnote number 10 right there. If y'all want to look into that, it gives an autobiography of Levi Ward Hancock. So apparently that can give some more information if you want to look into that. Little is known about this marriage and nothing is known about the conversations between Joseph and Emma regarding Alger. After the marriage with Alger ended in separation, Joseph seems to have set the subject of plural marriage aside until after the church moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. So we don't have a lot of information about it. Here it says that consent was obtained from her parents and her. So it sounds to me that Joseph was trying to do this properly. And and this is really hard. This is kind of my 2 cents here. Sometimes in life, especially with like spiritual things, sometimes we just have to accept that we're not going to get all of the answers. And the brethren tell us that, right? But this is speaking from Ashley's perspective personally. That has been very hard for me when it comes to my faith in general, because I want to know why about everything. Not in like an obnoxious way, but in a, okay, God, if I'm going to do this, I need all of the information. Essentially, I need information that that's going to connect to the dots for me to make it so I can trust you to do this. And God very lovingly recently even was like, I just need you to trust me. You know, we're not going to get the answer to every single question in this lifetime. We're just not. And that's on purpose, right? We have the information that we need to make it back to God, but part of that is that we need to exercise faith. That is part of life, and part of the gospel is that God wants us to exercise the faith in him and to trust him. And so that's kind of what I have seen here. I think I will probably stop. I don't think I need to read anymore to you guys. I think you get the general idea. Like I said, this is all going to be linked. But I think we just have to sometimes take God's word for it. And this is as much for me as it is for anybody else, because I want to know the answer to everything, not in an obnoxious, like little kid kind of why way. But that is just how my brain works. It's like, okay, if I'm going to do something, then I need to have all of the information and all of the pieces so I can build that foundation of understanding and then move forward. And so it's been hard for me to learn to just trust that sometimes the missing puzzle piece is God saying, you're going to have to wait for that information. And that is hard. And that sucks. And of course we want all of the information. And of course we want to know all the reasons why. But I do know that usually, well, maybe not usually, but a lot of times when God is withholding information, it's actually because he's being very merciful, because we are always going to be held accountable for the knowledge that we have. And, you know, I've said that before. And so, right, Joseph Smith is going to be held to a very different standard, right, than probably you and I are going to be held to, because he was given a very large responsibility and a very scary responsibility, not even just with polygamy, but with, oh my gosh, restoring the church. Gosh, words are hard today. I'm very sorry. And so I've said this before, you know what I mean? That's why God is not sending angels to everyone every single day, all day. Because if you start receiving those big experiences, especially before you're ready for them, you have to be held accountable for that. And for any, what am I trying to say here? Just, it doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room if you start to struggle with your faith. Essentially, this is not probably coming out very clear, and I'm very sorry. What I'm trying to say is that sometimes God doesn't give us all the information as a mercy, because we are held accountable for the information that we have, is what I'm trying to say. And so I am so grateful that this has not been a trial of mine, that I have not been asked to do this, right? That this has not been reinstated in my lifetime. Bless those early saints for their faith. And I loved learning that divorce was readily granted and speedily granted for women who were unhappy. And to me, that just speaks of the Lord's love for his daughters, because of course he knows how this affects them. Of course he knows that most women are not chomping at the bit to share their husband, right? And so, I don't know. that made my heart very happy. And I loved reading that little bit about Emma as well, where it said she essentially handled it with as much grace as anyone could be expected to, and bless Emma's sweet heart. I can't even imagine being Joseph Smith's wife. You know what I mean? Not because he was a bad man, but because how do you handle your husband constantly being tormented and sought after and imprisoned, and and then this revelation comes about polygamy, and it's like, bro, I don't even get to see you as it is. You know what I mean? It's like, and now I have to share you with other women. And so bless her. And if she doesn't have a ticket straight to the top of the celestial kingdom, then we're probably all out of luck, because she, in my mind, she deserves it. And so, again, with this kind of stuff, I try not to throw in too much of my own opinions, because I want people to learn for themselves. I want to clarify things as much as I can, as an imperfect human that doesn't have a lot of experience with this. But I also want to encourage people to research from the right sources and to look in the gospel library and related sources versus just the cesspool that is the internet. And to please pray and talk to God and receive your own witness and have a conversation with God about this, because he'll talk to you about it. He'll talk to you about anything and everything. So like I said, this is all going to be linked in the description, and, I'm sure you can fall down as many rabbit holes as you want, because there's so many different links in each of these. But I just admire the early saints. I admire Joseph. I admire Emma. I know that they weren't perfect, but none of us are. And I know that God knows us all perfectly and better than we know ourselves, which is why he calls the people that he does to the positions that he does. We all have something, right? We all have that one thing that makes us imperfect, but God uses us anyway. And how beautiful is that? I mean, that just is a testament of God's power, right? And the way that he is able to refine anything, including and especially us. And, there's that scripture that says that God qualifies the called. He doesn't call the qualified, because none of us are qualified, right? And that, I hope, is encouraging for you, because it's encouraging for me, because I don't know how to do like this social media stuff, for example. Like, I had no experience with this when God instructed me to start a podcast. And so he's definitely been with me, and I hope that that's encouraging as well. And so anyways, I think that's my 2 cents for this. And I hope that it was helpful, and that y'all can maybe learn a thing or two. And, I definitely understand that this is a testimony. This is straining for people's testimonies. I absolutely understand that. But hopefully this information can help. And so anyways, thank y'all so much for listening, and, and for stopping by, even if it was just for the first 2 minutes. And as always, I love you, but Jesus loves you more. And until next time, stay grounded and stay unshaken.